You wait outside until someone important calls you in. The words cut through the courtroom with the kind of casual cruelty that didn't need to be loud to land hard. Every head near the back turned for half a second, then turned away just as fast, the way people do when they know something is wrong but decide it is not their problem. Officer Derek Nolan stood near the rail with one hand resting on his duty belt, his jaw set in that smug little angle that said he believed the room belonged to him. And the man he was talking to, a black officer in a dark navy suit holding a plain brown case file against his side, did not move. He just stood there, calm and still, as if silence itself had weight. Imagine walking into a room built to honor justice and being treated like you had wandered in by mistake. Imagine knowing exactly who you are and still being forced to watch strangers decide you must be less. The courthouse in downtown St. Louis carried that old government chill, the kind that seeped through the walls even in early spring. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Shoes scraped across polished floors. A clerk whispered to a bailiff near the bench while lawyers shuffled papers with the detached rhythm of people who had long ago learned how to hide discomfort behind routine. It was supposed to be a hearing about misconduct. Another officer-involved case. Another family waiting for answers. Another morning where the language of accountability would be spoken under seal crests and American flags, while everyone silently wondered whether accountability would actually show up. Then Elijah Brooks walked in, and the room decided what he was before he ever opened his mouth. He did not look flashy. No polished brass on display. No dramatic entrance. Just a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a steady gaze, close-cropped hair, and the kind of posture that comes from discipline, not ego. He carried himself like someone who had spent years mastering the art of saying more with restraint than most people could say with noise. But restraint is often mistaken for weakness by people who have never had to earn either. Derek gave him one glance and dismissed him. Instantly. "You heard me," he said, tilting his head toward the hallway. "This section is reserved. Witnesses wait until they're called. Staff waits until they're told. And visitors don't stand around looking confused." A low chuckle slipped from one of the officers near the gallery wall. Another looked down at his phone, hiding a grin he did not bother to fully hide. Elijah said nothing. He simply reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded document, holding it out with a level hand. Derek did not take it. Not even a glance. Not even the dignity of pretending to care. He pushed the paper back with 2 fingers like it was an inconvenience. "I'm not reading that," he muttered. "Take a seat in the back or step outside." That was when something shifted, small enough that most people missed it. The court reporter paused with her fingers hovering above the keys. The clerk nearest the bench looked up a second time, this time longer. And at the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Sloan caught sight of the seal stamped in the upper corner of Elijah's document and went completely still. Elijah lowered the paper slowly, his face unreadable. The room thought it had just put him in his place. What it did not know, not yet, was that the man they were trying to send to the back of the courtroom had not come there to ask permission to stand. He had come there with the authority to decide who would still be standing when the truth was finally spoken out loud. Elijah did not argue because men like Derek Nolan were always most dangerous when they believed they had already won. He simply folded the document once, precise and unhurried, and slipped it back into his jacket while the room settled into that strained little silence that comes after a public humiliation no one wants to name. Up front, Judge Harold Whitman had not yet taken the bench, but his empty chair seemed to dominate the courtroom anyway, towering beneath the seal on the wall like a reminder that power in a place like this was rarely loud. It lived in glances, in delay, in who got acknowledged and who got made to wait. Rachel Sloan adjusted the stack of files in front of her. Without reading a word on the page, her eyes kept drifting back toward Elijah, then toward the door behind the bench, then back again. She had seen the seal on his paperwork. She knew enough not to speak too soon. Around her, though, the rest of the room moved on with the confidence of people certain they had already figured him out. A pair of officers near the rear pew leaned toward each other and whispered behind dry little smiles. A bailiff checked the time on the wall clock and shook his head as if Elijah had become one more inconvenience in a long day of bureaucratic irritation. In the gallery, the family of the young black man at the center of the misconduct hearing sat rigid and quiet, Sunday clothes pressed neat, hands folded tight in their laps. They had learned the American ritual of patience the hard way. Sit still. Speak softly. Wait to be recognized. Hope dignity survives the waiting. Elijah saw them from the corner of his eye and felt something old and familiar settle deeper in his chest. That was why he had come. Not for Derek. Not for the laughter. Not even for the insult that had been laid at his feet with such practiced ease. He had come because too many people had spent too many years walking into rooms like this one and learning that procedure could be used the same way some people used a weapon, not to protect truth, but to exhaust it. Derek took 2 lazy steps closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the disrespect sound personal. "You still here?" he asked. "I told you how this works." Elijah turned his head and met his gaze for the first time. There was no anger there. That almost made it worse. "I understand exactly how this works," he said. The sentence was quiet, but it landed hard enough that the court reporter looked up again. Derek gave a short laugh, the kind men use when they feel challenged but are not ready to admit it. "Then act like it." He motioned toward the back row without even looking. "Take a seat and wait your turn." Elijah glanced toward the bench, then toward Rachel Sloan, who now looked as though she was trying very hard not to interrupt history while it was still choosing its shape. The hallway door opened. The side conversations thinned. Judge Whitman entered in black robes with the weary expression of a man who had long ago convinced himself that distance was the same thing as fairness. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and began scanning the room with automatic authority. His gaze passed over the officers, the attorneys, the gallery, and then stopped when it reached Elijah Brooks. For 1 second, no more than that, the judge's face changed. It was small, almost invisible, but it was real. And in that second, Rachel Sloan closed her file. Derek Nolan straightened without knowing why, and the courtroom, without yet understanding it, began to realize that the wrong man had just been treated like he did not belong. Judge Whitman's fingers stopped on the edge of the bench, as if some invisible current had passed through the room and reached him a beat before it reached everyone else. He did not speak right away. That alone changed the temperature. Men like Harold Whitman were not known for hesitation. For 22 years on the circuit bench, he had built a reputation on composure so polished it looked like certainty. He had presided over dozens of hearings involving officer conduct, public complaints, sealed records, and carefully worded apologies that never seemed to reach the people most harmed by what happened in rooms like this. But now his eyes rested on Elijah Brooks with something far more revealing than recognition. It was caution. Derek Nolan noticed it without understanding it. His shoulders stiffened. The smugness that had carried him for the last several minutes did not vanish, but it flickered. He glanced toward the judge, then back at Elijah, trying to recover the easy confidence he had been wearing like a second badge. "Your Honor," Derek said, forcing a thin smile, "we were just getting the room settled." Judge Whitman did not answer him. Instead, he leaned back slightly and looked at the clerk. "Before we begin," he said, his voice measured, "I want the record to reflect all essential parties are present." The clerk nodded, though her eyes had already moved to Elijah again. Rachel Sloan slowly removed her glasses and placed them on the table in front of her. She had spent 9 years inside prosecutors' offices learning how power behaved when it sensed exposure. It usually got quieter before it got desperate. She could feel that quiet now. The hearing on paper was straightforward enough. A patrol officer from the North District had been accused of misconduct during a traffic stop that led to a disputed arrest, missing body camera minutes, and a chain of reports that did not align. Publicly, the case was being framed as a matter of incomplete documentation and witness inconsistency. Privately, people in the building knew there was more beneath it. They always knew. The real skill was pretending not to know until the right person forced the truth into daylight. Elijah remained where he was, one hand resting lightly against the file under his arm, his face unreadable. That calm had begun to unsettle the room far more than anger would have. Anger they could dismiss. Anger they could label. But a black man standing perfectly still in the center of their assumptions, refusing to shrink, refusing to explain himself before it was time, that made people nervous in a way they did not like to admit. In the gallery, Mrs. Lena Carter, the mother of the young man whose case had brought everyone here, looked at Elijah with the cautious hope of someone who had learned not to trust sudden miracles. Her son, 19-year-old Devin Carter, sat beside his attorney at the defense table in a borrowed navy blazer that hung a little loose at the shoulders. He kept his eyes down, but when the judge's tone shifted, he looked up. He saw what everyone else saw now. Not answers yet, but a crack in the pattern. Derek cleared his throat. Your Honor, if he is not assigned to this hearing, I can have him escorted to the rear until his matter is called. That was the mistake. Not because the words were loud, not because they were shocking, but because he said them after the judge had already shown concern. And in places built on hierarchy, timing can expose arrogance faster than any confession. Judge Whitman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Officer Nolan, he said, each word precise, I did not ask for your recommendation. Silence rolled across the courtroom. It was not dramatic. It was worse than that. It was official. Derek's face held for a second, then shifted under the pressure of being corrected in public. Behind him, one of the officers near the wall straightened and stared ahead. Rachel Sloan finally spoke, softly but clearly. Your Honor, I believe Captain Brooks is here in an official capacity connected to the court's review. The title landed like a dropped key in a locked room. Not loud, not forceful, but unmistakable. Derek turned toward her so quickly that his confusion showed before he could hide it. Captain. The word did not fully register for the gallery, not yet. But it hit the bench, the clerk, and the officers near the wall with immediate force. Elijah did not move. He did not need to. The room had just taken its first step toward the truth, and every person inside it could feel that whatever came next was going to reorder more than just the morning's hearing. The word captain did not echo through the courtroom, but it did something more powerful. It settled. It pressed into every corner of the room and made people recalculate what they thought they had seen. Derek Nolan stood very still, his expression caught between disbelief and the first cold flicker of embarrassment. It was not just that he had misjudged the man in front of him. It was that he had done it publicly, confidently, and in a room where rank was supposed to matter above all else. For the first time that morning, his eyes dropped to the file Elijah held instead of the color of the hand holding it. Judge Whitman cleared his throat and adjusted the papers before him, though everyone could tell he was not reading a single line. Captain Brooks, he said carefully, as if choosing the wrong tone now might carry consequences later. The court was not informed you would be appearing in person. Elijah finally stepped forward. No sudden movement, no drama, just the quiet authority of a man who had no need to perform it. That omission was intentional, Your Honor, he said. His voice was low and even, but it carried with ease. I was instructed to observe the room before the record began. The sentence landed harder than any accusation. Observe the room. Not attend. Not assist. Observe. Rachel Sloan lowered her gaze for a moment, hiding the fact that the words confirmed what she had been fearing since she saw the seal on his paperwork. This hearing had never been as simple as the docket made it look. The matter involving Devin Carter and the disputed arrest was only the visible surface. There had been concerns for months about altered timelines, disappearing reports, and officers whose testimony sounded polished in ways the truth rarely does. Rumors had drifted through the courthouse in cautious whispers, but rumors do not move systems. Documentation does. Authority does. And sometimes, so does the right witness arriving at the exact moment arrogance reveals itself. In the gallery, Mrs. Carter pressed a hand against her purse so tightly her knuckles paled. Beside her, Devin sat straighter in his chair, confusion slowly giving way to something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. Possibility. Not certainty, not yet, but something close enough to make his breathing change. Derek tried to recover. Men like him always did. If there has been some misunderstanding, he began, the edge in his voice now polished into something that wanted to sound respectful. I was only following standard courtroom procedure. Elijah looked at him then, fully, and that was somehow worse than anger would have been. There was no triumph in his face. No smirk. Just the steady gaze of a man who had heard that sentence too many times in too many rooms. Standard procedure, Elijah repeated softly. That depends on who is being seen and who is being ignored. No one moved. Even the court reporter seemed to hesitate before striking the keys again. Judge Whitman leaned back, the lines around his mouth deepening. He knew the danger now. Not just legal danger. Institutional danger. The kind that stains careers, invites scrutiny, and drags private habits into public view. Captain Brooks, he said, trying to reclaim control of the morning. State your official role for the record. Elijah set the brown file on the nearest table with deliberate care. The sound of paper meeting wood was barely audible, but in that silence it might as well have been a door closing. Captain Elijah Brooks, he said, each word clear enough to leave no room for retreat. Command Review Division, assigned as Senior Oversight Liaison to this inquiry and related procedural conduct matters. Derek's face lost what little color remained. One of the officers by the wall shifted his weight and stared at the floor. Rachel Sloane closed her eyes for the briefest second. And just like that, the courtroom understood the truth it had been circling all morning. Elijah Brooks had never been waiting for permission to enter the process. He had been sent there to measure the people already inside it. For a moment, no one in the courtroom seemed to remember how ordinary sound worked. The air conditioner still hummed. A page still turned somewhere near the defense table. A chair gave a small creak in the gallery. But everything human had gone still, as if the room itself understood that rank had just exposed something far more embarrassing than a procedural mistake. Elijah Brooks stood beside the table with one hand resting near the closed file, not guarding it, not dramatizing it, simply letting it exist where everyone could see it now. Judge Whitman folded his hands in front of him with the careful control of a man trying to keep authority from slipping through his fingers. "Very well," he said, though his voice lacked the easy confidence it had carried at the start of countless hearings before this one. "Captain Brooks, since you are present in an oversight capacity, the court will note your appearance." Elijah gave the slightest nod. Across from him, Rachel Sloane straightened the edge of her legal pad and finally allowed herself to study Derek Nolan openly. What she saw there was not remorse. Not yet. It was calculation. He was searching for a path back to safety, the way people do when they realize the rules they use to protect themselves are suddenly being measured by someone outside their circle. Derek wet his lips and tried again to sound composed. "Captain, if my conduct came across the wrong way, that was not my intention." The sentence floated out into the room with all the smoothness of a rehearsed excuse. Elijah did not interrupt. That made Derek keep talking, and that made the mistake worse. "We deal with a lot of confusion on hearing days," he said. "People come in without proper identification, without clear assignments, and we have to make judgment calls quickly. Imagine saying that in a room where everyone just watched exactly what kind of judgment had been used. Imagine thinking tone could erase pattern." Elijah turned his head slightly toward the bench, but his words were for the whole courtroom. "Judgment calls become habits when no one questions them," he said. "And habits become systems when they only ever fall in one direction." No one laughed now. No one checked a phone. Even the officers near the wall, the same men who had smirked earlier, seemed to understand that every expression on their faces might matter before the day was over. In the gallery, Mrs. Carter's eyes glistened, though she kept her chin lifted high. Devin Carter sat frozen, staring at Elijah with the stunned look of someone seeing dignity speak his language inside a place that had only ever spoken over him. Judge Whitman shifted in his chair. "Captain Brooks," he said, "to avoid unnecessary disruption, I would ask that we proceed with the scheduled matter and reserve any additional concerns for administrative review." There it was. The old courthouse instinct. Keep the embarrassment off the main record. Move the morning forward. Bury discomfort inside process and call it order. Elijah looked up at the bench, calm as ever. "The scheduled matter is the concern, Your Honor." That sentence changed everything. Rachel Sloane slowly turned toward him. Derek's face tightened. The clerk stopped writing. Elijah placed his palm lightly on the file and continued. "This hearing does not stand apart from procedural conduct. It is part of it. My office was assigned because the integrity of prior statements, officer coordination, and courtroom handling in connected matters raised questions significant enough to require direct observation." The words were precise, but the meaning was unmistakable. This was no longer just about Devin Carter's case file. It was about the behavior surrounding it. The missing minutes, the matching narratives, the confidence with which some men had assumed no one important was watching. Derek took one involuntary step back before catching himself. Judge Whitman's expression hardened, not with strength, but with the strain of a man realizing the morning had slipped beyond routine. Elijah did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The truth had entered the courtroom quietly, And now it was doing what truth always does when power underestimates it. It was making everyone show themselves. Judge Whitman's attempt to contain the morning inside procedure had failed, and everyone in the room knew it. The courtroom had crossed that invisible line where a hearing stops feeling routine and starts feeling like a test. Not just of facts, but of character, of instinct, of who had gotten comfortable deciding which people deserved patience and which people did not. Elijah Brooks let the silence stretch a second longer before he opened the file. He did not flip through it dramatically. He did not scatter papers or sharpen his tone. He simply lifted the cover and turned to the first tab with the calm precision of a man who had spent years learning that the most powerful thing in a room full of assumptions is documented truth. For the record, he said, my office was not assigned to review a single incident in isolation. We were assigned to examine a pattern. The word pattern moved through the courtroom like a draft under a locked door. Rachel Sloane lowered her eyes to the table, but only for a moment. She already knew pieces of this. Not all of it, but enough to understand why Elijah had been sent in person. 3 prior complaints had been labeled inconclusive. 2 witness statements had been revised after initial submission. 1 internal note had disappeared from a supplemental file and then reappeared without signature metadata. On paper, each detail looked small enough to survive on its own. Together, they formed something else entirely. Devin Carter's case had become the thread that pulled the rest of it loose. Derek Nolan stared at the open file as if he could will it shut again. The confidence was gone now, stripped away not by shouting, but by context. Captain, he said, trying to keep his voice level. If there are concerns about records, those are usually handled through departmental review, not in open court. Elijah glanced at him. Usually, he said, but not when courtroom conduct itself becomes part of what must be reviewed. That landed hard because everyone understood what he meant. The issue was not only what happened on reports or behind closed doors. It was what had happened here, in plain sight, before the hearing even properly began. A black officer had entered the room carrying lawful authority, and the first reaction had not been professionalism. It had been dismissal, suspicion, correction without inquiry. Judge Whitman shifted again, slower this time. He knew the record had become dangerous territory. Captain Brooks, he said, are you alleging bias by officers attached to this proceeding? Elijah rested one hand on the edge of the table and looked toward the bench with the same steady expression he had carried all morning. I am stating that conduct observed today aligns with concerns already documented in connected matters. He let the sentence sit. Then he added, I am also stating that assumptions made before verification carry consequences, especially when they are made under color of authority. In the gallery, Mrs. Carter closed her eyes briefly as if the words had reached some place in her spirit that had been clenched for months. Devin looked from Elijah to Derek, then to the judge, and for the first time since entering the building, he no longer looked like a young man waiting to be processed. He looked like someone beginning to understand that the room was no longer moving in only one direction. Rachel Sloane finally spoke, careful and clear. Your Honor, in light of Captain Brooks's assignment, the prosecution requests that all pre-hearing interactions involving personnel in this courtroom be preserved in the record. Derek turned toward her with open disbelief. He had expected the usual insulation, the quiet protection of familiar roles. But that was the thing about systems built on confidence. They only hold as long as everyone agrees to pretend. And one by one, the people in this room were losing the ability to pretend. The clerk began typing faster, every keystroke suddenly sounding louder than it had before. One of the officers near the wall swallowed and stared straight ahead, no longer interested in anyone else's expression. Judge Whitman looked down at the bench, then out at the room, then back at Elijah Brooks. In that moment, he seemed to grasp what Derek had failed to understand from the beginning. Elijah had not come to make a scene. He had come because a scene had already been made too many times before, only never by the people who controlled the record. Now the record belonged to the truth, and the truth was taking its time. The courtroom had stopped pretending this was just another hearing, but Elijah Brooks knew better than to confuse discomfort with accountability. Rooms like this could absorb a great deal of truth and still try to survive unchanged. That was how institutions protected themselves. They did not always deny what happened. Sometimes they simply reduced it, renamed it, filed it under the language of process until pain looked technical and bias sounded accidental. Elijah had seen that pattern before in briefing rooms, internal reviews, and late-night conference tables where everyone spoke carefully and no one wanted to say out loud what the evidence already knew. He had not built his career by being the loudest man in those rooms. He had built it by being the one who noticed what others worked hardest not to see. Judge Whitman glanced toward the clerk, then toward Rachel Sloan, as if hoping someone else might hand him a version of the morning that could still be managed. But Rachel had already crossed the point of safe ambiguity. "Your Honor," she said, "the prosecution renews its request that all interactions involving relevant officers, courtroom staff, and pre-hearing communications be preserved without amendment." Her words were crisp, but her voice carried the weight of someone who understood this request would reach far beyond the walls of Courtroom 4B. It would touch email chains, hallway conversations, sign-in logs, officer notes, even the order in which people were acknowledged when the day began. Derek Nolan let out a slow breath through his nose, the kind a man takes when he realizes his choices have become evidence. "This is getting out of hand," he said, too quickly, then seemed to regret hearing himself sound defensive. "I made a call based on appearance and position in the room. That is all." Elijah turned one page in the file and then another, letting the sound of paper do the work that raised voices never could. "Based on appearance," he repeated. "Not accusing, not theatrical, just exact." Derek's eyes narrowed, but he did not answer. He did not need to. The phrase had already exposed him. Imagine standing in a courtroom and hearing a man explain his judgment as if what he saw first was enough. Imagine how many times that sentence had already shaped outcomes before anyone bothered to document it. In the gallery, Mrs. Carter drew in a careful breath, and Elijah noticed the way Devin sat with his hands clasped so tightly together that his thumbs pressed white at the edges. That young man had walked into this building expecting another lesson in power, another reminder that procedure could be bent without ever appearing broken. Elijah knew that look because he had carried a version of it himself years ago, long before the captain bars, long before the command meetings, back when he was a patrol officer learning that professionalism did not always protect you from being mistaken for someone lesser by men wearing the same uniform. He remembered being asked twice for identification in his own district station while white rookies walked through without a glance. He remembered the smile that said, "Do not take it personally." He remembered older black officers telling him to stay measured, stay excellent, stay patient, because the burden of proving you belong will be handed to you again and again until you learn to carry it without letting it bend your spine. He had carried it, but he had also kept records, dates, names, language, patterns, not out of bitterness, out of duty. That was why he had accepted this assignment in person instead of sending a memo or a junior review team. The Carter file was not just another case. It was the point where too many small dismissals had finally gathered enough weight to become undeniable. Judge Whitman looked down at the bench and spoke more quietly than before. "Captain Brooks, if there are connected matters you believe affect the integrity of these proceedings, the court will hear them." Elijah closed the file halfway and rested his hand over it. "There are," he said, "and before this day is over, every person in this room is going to understand why the way this morning began matters just as much as the case that brought us here." The courtroom did not feel cold anymore. It felt exposed. That was the difference. Cold could be endured. Exposure made people restless. Judge Whitman sat with both hands folded now, no longer pretending this was a hearing he could steer back into the comfort of ordinary procedure. Rachel Sloan had gone completely still, the way skilled attorneys do when they understand the next few sentences may matter more than the previous 6 months of paperwork. Derek Nolan stood near the rail with his shoulders squared too stiffly, as if posture alone could hold together a version of the morning that was already falling apart. Elijah Brooks looked at each of them in turn, then opened the file to a section marked with a blue tab. "Connected matters," he said, his tone measured, "include repeated discrepancies in officer statements, premature coordination before testimony, missing timeline details in the Carter arrest file, and multiple documented instances where individuals entering legal spaces were treated according to assumption before verification." No one interrupted. He turned one page. 3 complaints from the same district involved the same language pattern. Delayed acknowledgement, challenged authority, informal redirection away from primary access points. In each case, the subject was black. In each case, Verification came second. Derek tried to speak, but Judge Whitman lifted one hand without even looking at him. That was how quickly the room had changed. The officer who had controlled the threshold minutes ago could not even control the timing of his own defense now. Elijah continued. This morning was not separate from the file. It confirmed the pattern. Imagine being so accustomed to disrespect that you recognize it before it fully forms. Imagine watching a man with lawful authority be treated like an interruption simply because the room had already decided what rank looked like before he ever spoke. In the gallery, Mrs. Carter pressed a hand lightly to her chest. Devin sat motionless, eyes fixed on Elijah, as though any movement might break the fragile fact that someone in power was finally saying out loud what families like his had always been expected to survive in silence. Rachel Sloan drew a slow breath. "Captain Brooks," she said, "does your office have a formal finding tied to officer conduct in this proceeding?" Elijah closed the file just enough to rest his hand on it. "My office has authority to initiate one," he said. Then, after the briefest pause, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a leather credential wallet, placing it on the table where the judge, the prosecutor, and every officer in the room could see it. When he opened it, the gold insignia caught the courtroom lights without a trace of showmanship. "For clarity on the record," he said, each word deliberate, "I am Captain Elijah Brooks, Senior Command Liaison for the Command Review Division, with direct reporting authority to the Deputy Commissioner on matters involving interdepartmental integrity, courtroom coordination, and supervisory compliance." Derek's face emptied, not of emotion, of certainty. That was what froze him. The understanding that this was not just a higher-ranking officer. This was a man positioned above the informal protections people like Derek had relied on for years. A man who did not need district approval to act. A man who had not come to be impressed by local explanations. Judge Whitman stared at the credential a moment too long before looking up. One of the officers by the wall took a half-step back without seeming to realize he had moved. The clerk's fingers hovered over the keys, then resumed with new urgency. Elijah turned his eyes to Derek at last. His voice never hardened. "It did not need to. You told me to wait outside until someone important called me in," he said. "That statement is now part of the record. So is the fact that you made it before asking a single verifying question." The silence that followed was complete. Not fearful, not chaotic. Final. Because in that instant, every person in the courtroom understood the same thing. They had not merely underestimated a black officer. They had revealed themselves to the one man in the room with both the rank and the authority to make that revelation matter. No one rushed to fill the silence because there was nothing left in it to protect. Derek Nolan stood in the same spot where he had tried to turn authority into humiliation, but now the balance had shifted so completely that even his breathing seemed too loud for the room. Judge Whitman looked from the credential to the file, then to the Carter family, and for the first time that morning, he seemed less like the center of the courtroom than a man being forced to witness what the courtroom had become. Elijah Brooks closed the credential wallet and placed it beside the file with quiet finality. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask for an apology. Men like Derek often mistook volume for power. Elijah never had. "Let the record reflect," he said, "that pre-hearing conduct observed in this courtroom is to be preserved in full, including staff positioning, officer statements, and acknowledgement sequence from the moment legal access began." The clerk nodded quickly and resumed typing with both hands, each keystroke sounding sharp against the hush. Rachel Sloan rose from her seat, collected but no longer distant. "The prosecution joins that request," she said, "and in light of Captain Brooks's authority, requests immediate preservation of all related officer communications, corridor logs, and supplementary reporting connected to the Carter matter." Derek turned toward her as if betrayal had just entered the room, but what he was seeing was not betrayal. It was structure changing shape around the truth. Judge Whitman drew in a slow breath. "So ordered," he said at last, and those two words landed with more force than anything else spoken that day. Because now it was official. Now the morning could not be folded into rumor or smoothed into memory. It belonged to the record. In the gallery, Mrs. Carter covered her mouth for a second, not to hide pain this time, but to steady the emotion rising too fast to contain. Beside her, Devin Carter looked down, then back up again, as if he was learning in real time that dignity could return to a room even after being pushed to the edges of it. Elijah turned one final page in the file and looked directly at the bench. "My recommendation," he said, "is that the court proceed with the Carter hearing only after noting that today's observed conduct may bear on credibility, handling, and institutional bias relevant to connected testimony." Judge Whitman gave a small, restrained nod. He knew what that meant. The hearing would continue, but not under the old illusion. Not with the same unchecked confidence. Not with the same assumption that the room itself could be trusted simply because it looked official. Derek's mouth parted like he wanted to explain himself one last time, but no words came. Maybe because he finally understood that explanation was not the same as erasure. Maybe because he had just learned the hardest lesson men like him ever face. The person you dismiss may be the very person holding the mirror. Elijah gathered the file, left the credential on the table just long enough for the sight of it to settle into every mind present, then picked it up and stepped back with the same calm he had carried from the beginning. No triumph, no cruelty, just control. That was what made it unforgettable. He had entered the courtroom in silence, been measured by the worst instincts in the room, and answered not with anger, but with truth precise enough to stop power in its tracks. And as the hearing finally moved forward under a different kind of weight, one thing had become impossible to ignore. They thought rank lived in a title, a doorway, a seat near the bench. But that morning, rank revealed itself in something far greater. In discipline. In truth. In the refusal to become smaller just because someone else needed you to be. They ignored the man before they knew his position. Then they froze when they learned his rank. But the real lesson came after that. Because by the time the truth stood up in that courtroom, every badge in the room had already been outranked.